Hello everybody and welcome to part 2 of the 4 days battle. So, let's just get straight at it. I'm gonna do day 1 and 2 here. Well, day 0, 1 and 2. So, due to diplomatic relations at the time, French had pledged their fleet to the Dutch. So the Dutch wanted, of course, that fleet. And with reports of the French fleet going to set sail to help said Dutch, or to go help the Dutch, Rupert took a small squadron and set about to meet the French to the south. And trying to link up with the Dutch, trying to link up with the French, the Dutch went out to sea to look for the English fleet. Of course, the French being the French, they didn't set sail at all. So, whilst Rupert was absent, since he was out looking for the French, Albemarle was commanding the fleet of the British. And nearing the afternoon of the day before the battle, both Dutch and English scouts sighted each other, and the fleets maneuvered towards each other. And as you can see on the picture I'm putting on now, you will see the location of the battles during the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th of June, or the 11th, 12th, 13th and 14th of June, or day 1, 2 and 3. Day 1, 2, 3 and 4. So those were the locations. As you can see, day 1 and 2 are pretty close. Day 3, more to the English side of things. And day 4 was pretty much middle again. Albeit a bit more north than day 1 and 2. The strength of both fleets during day 1, with the English having one squadron away with Rupert. The English only had 56 warships on day 1, and the Dutch had 85, so about 24 more warships. Also, the Dutch had more yachts and fireships, with the Dutch having 6 yachts and 9 fireships, while the British having 4 fireships and no yachts. The English, however, they initiated the battle early in the morning, and they started their approach on the Dutch. The British were hoping to catch the Dutch off guard, kind of while they were anchored to the east of the English. And Albemarle was thus trying to engage just a small part of the Dutch fleet, while the rest were busy deploying since they were, well, anchored. Tromp, however, noticing the English advance, he had already started sailing beam reach to engage with the British, and just after noon both fleets were within firing range of each other, and the Clove Tree was the ship that got the honor of getting the first broadside put into him, or her I mean, is a ship after all. And with the fleet sailing in parallel, the situation was as you can see on the picture, with both fleets sailing kind of southeast, east-southeast, roughly. And with quite a decent part of the Dutch squadron not being able to engage due to being too far leeward compared to the rest of the Dutch fleet. So, Tromp was leading the formation, as you can see by the diagram, graph, whatever it's called, picture, illustration, I don't know. And he managed to keep up with White Squadron, which was ahead of the British line. And soon, Tromp actually outsailed White Squadron. And Tromp kept a more windward course, and this caused the lines to straighten out as the English right, which were at the moment, because Tromp was ahead of them, unopposed. They were also sailing in a more windward direction, so the lines straightened out in a more windward or upwind direction, and order quickly settled in. Or actually quite slowly, since it's Age of Sail, things didn't exactly happen quickly back then usually. And for the next couple of hours, both lines I don't know what to call it. they just sat there pounding at each other at a moderate distance, while Trump's starboard battery engaged Barclay, of course Trump being to the lee of Barclay. He ordered his ships steered slightly to starboard, so to sail more close hold. And this brought Barclay closer to the wind, and some of the Dutch vessels trailing Trump used this opportunity to cross the English line, and they engaged from the other side, pinning the English in a slight crossfire. I don't know for how long this happened, but I believe the Dutch later settled into the lee as well, it seems, from the pictures. Especially the next one. But we'll get to the next picture soon. But for the next couple of hours, the oh wait, I already said that. So, after a while, the 54-gun Beschermer ventured a courageous run against the White Squadron and ended up in front of White Squadron, engaging ships with both her batteries, so both starboard and port. And there's no surprise, she got met with heavy fire, and eventually she had to disengage. Like I said, no surprise, if you go balls deep, you should expect heavy fire. And shortly after, the 34-gun Leist did the same. And she suffered also heavy damage, especially to her rigging. But however, overall, very few fleet-wide or individual maneuvers were made. The 54-gun Beschermer and 34-gun Leist being the exception. And yeah, so during the first pass, both how they were sailing, both fleets suffered from the usual problems of the leeward and the windward position. The Dutch, being leeward, could fire all the batteries. However, of course, or all their guns in the battery. However, of course, they were suffered from shots going into the hull, could be in a position on the hull where if they were to tack, those holes would suddenly be underwater. Of course, the Dutch like to fire on the uproll, which was a good thing sailing being leeward for them then. And the English sailing having the wind being a windward to the Dutch faced another problem with not being able to open their bottom gun decks due to the heavy seas of the day. So the Dutch opponent effectively, both having more ships, although not all of them larger, a lot of them actually smaller, they had more effective guns as well. And over time the differences in firing order became visible as well. As I said, the Dutch preferred firing in the up roll against mast and rigging, and of course somewhat hull, while the British preferred to shoot on the down roll and shoot mostly at the hull. And this caused, well, the Dutch were getting hulled while the British got a lot of damage to rigging. And despite over 100 ships firing for hours on end at each other, the damage on either side at this point was minimal, and the English were in fact content with continuing the current engagement, giving the Dutch center and rear time to join the formation and fight. However, of course, the British weren't going to be able to keep on the engagement as this, because a certain Everton with some Zeelanders and the Frisians, they joined in on the fight. They found an already occupied lee battery English fleet, so the English fleet firing away at their with their lee battery at the Dutch. And not wasting a moment, they moved to the windward of the English rear, which was the Blue Squadron. And that was unfortunate for the Blue Squadron, since now they were fighting with opponents to both their batteries. They were getting shot at by two ships essentially for every one of theirs. So being under fire from two lines, Blue Squadron started to lose order. However, there were some major events that happened. Out of nowhere, two ships caught fire. One of them was sailing under Everton, and that was the 58-gun Hof van Zeeland, and the other was the 46-gun Usefull, which was part of the Reuter squadron. And there was a collision with the 54-gun Hollandia. And after a brief moment of terror on both ships, both the Klein Hollandia and I believe the Usefull, they each went their own path, with the Usefull exploding soon afterwards due to, well, set fire. And of course, seeing the blue in distress, Albemarle ordered red and blue to tack to starboard to sail northwest again, and white would do a similar move and fall in behind blue. So what usually would happen, of course, is first red would tack, then white. However, in this situation, Albemarle, to save as much time as possible, the white would tack first, followed by red, or they would tack at the same time, so that white would be still in the middle, but compared to red, white would be in front of red. And during this, the Dutch center was unopposed and they settled in for some repairs. And meanwhile, the red met the Frisians and the Zeelanders under Evertsen, and they were stuck in fighting. So as you can see by the first diagram I put up, hopefully, you will see white squadron tacking and later red squadron would tack, so that red would be behind white. And exactly that's what you see in the next one, where red would tack last and end up behind even blue. So as you can see by the squadron, the Dutch, or the graph or the drawing, the Dutch continued on their way, and at the van, however, a catastrophe was, however, about to take place while all of this maneuvering was happening. When Barclay, Vice Admiral of the White, close to the Dutch, and two Dutch ships collided when this happened. The 68-gun Lifte and the 80-gun Hollandia, commanded by Tromp. And there was a crash which, not surprisingly, caused a lot of damage on both ships. And as a result of the ram as well, both of those ships ended up falling somewhat to the lee of the line, of the Dutch line. And Barclay saw an opportunity to harass the helpless ships which had just collided. However, he bore up through the Dutch line, and the English ships trailing Barclay didn't follow the admiral. And they just engaged the main Dutch line. And the Dutch quickly closed the gap which was created by the collision, and all alone the Swifter suddenly was being focused on by Dutch ships. And she was swarmed, and she was quickly boarded and taken. And in the process, Admiral Barclay was killed. And the ship that had the honor of capturing the Swifter, I believe that the Swifter was, yeah, that was the 72-gun Reiger. And due to the damage she received during the process, she had to disengage, and she towed her prize, the Swifter, to port. And whilst the white were tacking, the Dutch were pressing after the English as well soon. And they were also able to swarm a couple more ships, the Seven Oaks, previously Dutch, Safe and Folden, and the 42-gun Loyal George. The Seven Oaks was taken by the Beschermer, and the Loyal George was taken by the Deventer. And Tromp, in the meantime, due to his ship, the Hollandia, being damaged, he switched his flagship to the 66-gun Younger Prince. And he had ordered the damaged Hollandia to be towed home by the 34-gun Asperen. So, I'm gonna put some paintings up. So, first off is a painting by the Hollandia, or of the Hollandia being disabled essentially due to the crash. And second off, you'll see a painting of the capture of the three British ships, the Swifter, the Seven Oaks, and the Loyal George. Which, of course, I believe the ship in front is the Loyal George. who has just struck her, or who now has Dutch colors flying. But I might be wrong on that, so don't quote me on that. Anyways, so while this boarding was happening, which you saw on the painting, the fleet under Everton had, or was busy passing the White Squadron, as you could see by the drawing, or I guess I need to find a good name for that. The depiction of the tactics, which I'll pop up again. And they were passing by the White Squadron, and they were almost reunited with the main Dutch fleet. Not quite yet though, as you can see. And the Red and Blue Squadrons, while this was happening, they were not engaged by any fleet, so they spent some time repairing their rigging and masts to their best ability. And when the Reuter Squadron finished their repairs, the Reuter bore up to re-engage the English, and Trump's division fell in behind, not as in fell behind that he was left behind Bestefa, which is the Reuter, and Everton again. And Everton again would follow behind. While most of the fleet managed to get windward of the English, not all of them. And they were to pass the English fleet to the leeward, and again would result in 2 Dutch lines passing a single English one. Which you can see by the drawing here, by the... I forgot what I was gonna call it, by the tactical depiction. So as you see, you can see the 2 Dutch lines passing the English line, and dotted line is where they're going, and solid line is where they are, essentially. So the Dutch passed the British with 1 to the leeward and 1 to the windward, and they would pass the English on 2 sides, and then they would reunite after passing the English, and they would tack to the south, and then they would pass the English line again. Except now, instead of being 2 Dutch lines, there would be 1 line, and while that was happening, while the Dutch were happening, the English would continue their course, and they would eventually also tack, going northwestish. However, during this pass, while they were doing all of this, the wind settled, and both the leeward and the windward batteries of both fleets were to be utilized, so even more guns were in the playing fields now. And the carnage that followed during all this maneuvering lasted for several hours on the Dutch side, on both sides, and on the Dutch side, due to heavy damage taken, the younger prince had to disengage, and Trump was forced to shift his flag to a new ship, which was the 54-gun Provincie van Utrecht. And on the English side, Albemarle took a splinter to the head, and that was a bit of a bother. But it was only a light wound, so he was fine. And soon after, the Dutch weren't the only ones that were going to have 2 friendlies ramming each other. The British the English had the 50-gun Jersey and the 48-gun Portland. They rammed each other. However, the reason is unknown. But the Jersey, the 50-gun Jersey, was quite lucky and was barely harmed. However, the Portland had to be sent back to port. While the return of the Portland marked the end of the first day of fighting, both fleets settled in for the night, and Sons of Repair, which was going to happen pretty much every night of day 1, 2, 3, and 4, there would be repairs. And those, of course, would be disrupted by sounds of screams and all of that happens when you have surgery at the time. Since you didn't have a way to put people down, make them shut up. When suddenly, a terrific eruption of Dutch cannon fire broke the silence, and Albemarle was confused. And Everton, I believe it was, said the following: "An English crew must be fighting for its life." Which was right, and that crew belonged to the 80-gun Henry, which was commanded by Rear Admiral of the White Harman. And in the last passing of the day, she had suffered a lot of damage to her rigging, and she was incapable of tacking back to the British fleet. And after some hours of preparing, she sailed northwest to get together back to the English fleet. However, unknown to her, she was about to pass through the Dutch while they were anchored. And she received a devastating pounding. However, because of the cover of night and some damned good luck for him, he was able to dodge 2 fire ships, the Vrijheid and the Gouden Ruiter. And the Dutch fleet, she managed to get back home. However, she suffered greatly. She lost 100 men killed and half as many, so about 50 wounded. And that's of a complement of 440. That's not an insignificant amount. Oops, repair the wrong thing. So, in her parting shot, however, she fired at the Dutch with one of her chasers, I believe. And Everton Sr. was to have an damned unfortunate meeting with a cannonball. And he died. It's unfortunate for Everton. Everton Senior, so yeah. From now on, when I say Everton, it's about Everton Junior and not Senior. Just as a little note. Now, with the end of that skirmish, the fleet settled again for the night. And the Henry would continue towards port because she was quite damaged from the situation. And accompanying the Henry, there was the 56 gun Rainbow, who was chased off earlier in the evening. And on the Dutch side, they also sent some ships, more ships back to port. We had the 62 gun Delft, which was sent to port to repair, and the 64 gun Gelderland, which was sent with the Delft as well. However, not for repairs. The reason is unknown. So, following day 1, the following losses were made. The British had the heavier losses since, well, the Dutch technically lost 4 ships. 2 of those were fire ships which were used, while the British lost 3 ships. The Dutch also had more gains since they captured 3 ships. So the British, they lost the Swiftsure, the Sevenoaks and the Loyal George, while the Dutch lost the Hof van Zeeland, Teuvenvoorde, Vrijheid, which was one of the fire ships, and the Gouden Ruiter, also one of the fire ships. Disengaged, however, the Dutch lost a lot more. So, effective in this battle, the Dutch lost a lot more. They lost 7 ships, being the Reiger, Hollandia, Asperen, Delft, Beventer and Beschermer. While the British lost the Portland, the Henry and the Rainbow. And for the most part, the Dutch lost for this engagement the heavier ships, losing most of them being above 60 guns. And all of them, bar the Asperen, were more than 50 guns. So the Dutch definitely lost more after day 1. However, of course, they gained the 3 British prizes, which can't complain about that. And of course, the Dutch would continue to have more ships disengaged during the battle, and the British as well, and both would lose some. So, after a quick commercial break for me, where I get to take a little break, we'll continue on to day 2. So, I'll be right back. And we are back. So, now I'm just sailing in the open world. So, on the morning of the second day, so we're going to the second day now, we've done the first day. During the second day of the battle, or on the morning of the second day of the battle, the Ruiter was surprised to learn that part of the Dutch fleet was missing. And unknown to either Trump or the Ruiter, Trump's squadron actually chased the Rainbow, which the day before had gone to port. So, or did it go to port? No, it went to port. So they had chased the Rainbow off the field the day before or the evening. And Trump himself had missed attack during the night and ended up west of the Dutch fleet. Whilst the Dutch were regrouping, the English bore up for an attack, and the group that chased the Rainbow off, they were of course missing. So the Dutch kind of had less ships than previously. So both fleets tried to gain the weather gauge during the battle. or during the early stages of the day. And the Dutch, hoping to utilize their fire ships, of course, wanted the weather gauge. And they also wanted to be able to close quarter combat, since that's what the Dutch were good at. And the English, of course, wanted to gain the weather gauge to stop the Dutch from using the fire ships. And they also hoped to isolate Trump's squadron, which was still catching up to the Dutch rear. So, it was the English who won the race for the weather gauge. Yet, it didn't deter the Dutch from maintaining course. And the real result was a series of head-on passes between the Dutch front and the English center, which you can see by the drawing or the tactical illustration. And whereas on the fighting on the first day was hard, there were moments of sportsmanlike conduct. And it was even recorded that during the initial fight, the crew recognized each other's ships and aimed for each other ensigns. However, both sides recognized that on the second day, the fighting was nothing short of brutal. And the range which was fought at was literally point blank. And the damage sustained by both fleets was terrible as a result. And over the course of the morning and early afternoon, roughly 7 head-on passes had been made by both fleets, and they were both exhausted. And the time taken for one of those passes, due to the length of the lines, was about 40 minutes. And during the first 2 passes of the day, of course, the fleets would try and force themselves windward through the enemy lines. And to quote an account from the States General, the 2 fleets made a motion phase. The Hollanders towards the northwest, and the English, should mute my phone, towards the south, with designed to follow one another. But the English, having the advantage of the wind, disputed their enemy's passage, being the Dutch, and without waiting any longer, advanced to them and fell upon them. The Hollanders, without changing their course or their countenance, stood firm in the luffing, so that the 2 hostile fleets broke through one another and began the most furious fight. So, during a single head-on pass, a ship would fire about 4 broadsides and receive about the same amount of broadsides. And the damage by head-on passes was nowhere near as devastating as side-by-side passes, where in the latter the fleets would sail parallel to each other until one fleet made a move or gave way. And when I say side-by-side passes sailing parallel, they would literally sail in the same direction, parallel to each other, and not sailing in opposite directions parallel. That would be head-on passes. So, the 2 first passes were quite successful for the Dutch, and the English were forced to send 7 ships back to port. And among them were the Anne, the Baltimore, and the Bristol, of about 58, 48, and 52 guns. And the other 4 ships which were sent home were marked as unknown. And at the end of the second pass of the day, the wind died and created a prolonged interval. And at roughly 11 o'clock in the morning, or I guess it was approaching noon, morning it still is, the wind rose up again and both fleets charged for another pass. And it was during the third pass that the Dutch gained the weather gauge. And it was at the price of course, a very ferocious fight between the van of both fleets. And in the end, the Dutch still succeeded, so yeah, they got that going for them. This event, of course, marked a new stage in the battle, since the Dutch had just gained the weather gauge for the first time. And the Dutch were preparing for a general attack, which meant every ship was to prepare for boarding, which the Dutch loved. The Dutch and the British realized this, but the Dutch were excellent in boarding. While the British were better than the Dutch at gunnery, so keeping those guns firing and hitting their target, the Dutch excelled at boarding. And each ship during a general attack was going to prepare for boarding and chasing of enemy ships. And this was something the British had feared, like I said, since they knew very well the Dutch power in boarding. And yeah, that was unfortunate for the British. And de Ruyter had given the command to hoist the bloedvlag, or the blood flag in English, signaling the general assault. And it was right at this command that the sounds of muskets and heavy cannon fire was heard. And I'm an idiot. Off day one I got the wrong guy. It was Albemarle that remarked, an English crew must be fighting for his life. I'm not smart. I don't know how I got Everton in my mind. Either way, I'll try to remember to fix that in post-editing. But yeah, de Ruyter said, at that point, some ships must be making their last stand, so similar to the remark that Albemarle did. And it turned in fact out to be Tromp and his squadron, who had failed to break through windward, as going to be shown by this tactical chart, which seems quite messy. But as you can see by the chart, de Ruyter, Evertsen, Mappel, Van Ness and de Lifte had managed to pass through and gain the weather gauge. However, Tromp, he was sailing downwind, with the British line in hot pursuit, with part of the White Squadron on the starboard side of Tromp's squadron, while other part of the line on the port side. So, yeah. The Dutch were, of course, the Dutch that were trapped were getting absolutely destroyed. And the 64-gun Provincie van Utrecht, which at the time was Tromp's flagship, the 68-gun Spiegel, and the 73-gun, another odd number, Pacificatie, and 68-gun Lifte, 70-gun Callandsoog, and the 60-gun Vrijheid suffered crippling damage to masts and spars during this time. And unfortunately for the Dutch, this consisted of parts of the heaviest ships of the Dutch fleet, and that would most definitely be noticed by the Dutch. And the English used a couple of fireships at that moment. They used the Spread Eagle, which failed to hit its goal, and the Young Prince, which managed to hit or get on the Lifte and burned her to crisp. So one Dutch ship sank, or was burned more precisely. So whilst Tromp's squadron was crawling north to get away from the fray, because they were in a bad situation, Jordan turned to engage parallel with the Dutch fleet. And one of his ships, the 52-gun Antelope, went through the Dutch and ported the Spiegels where Van der Hulst was on board. And during the boarding, Van der Hulst was, unfortunately for the Dutch, killed due to a musket ball to the head chest. And the Antelope, due to this, was anticipating that she would strike her colors. However, reinforcements led by de Ruyter had appeared at this time, and due to heavy fire, the Antelope had to force to disengage, and the Spiegel was able to sail to safety. However, in that brief engagement, the Antelope suffered 21 deaths and 30 wounded, so 50 crew lost, out of a crew of 190. That's about a 25% crew loss. That's significant. So, de Ruyter's maneuver, however, had left him and his squadron exposed to attack from the windward of the British, and de Ruyter was still on its way, but whilst he was covering the distance, he signalled Van Ness and de Lifte to maintain the southeastern course, and furthermore, he signalled the Zeeland-Friesland squadron to fall in with Van Ness. And this goal was to keep the English occupied by having part of their fleet to their windward. And this maneuver, unknown to de Ruyter and the Dutch at the time, made the English highly uncomfortable. And this made them also highly hesitant to make a decision to turn to leeward and destroy de Ruyter and Tromp, which of course, the British being hesitant, was great for the Dutch. And this gave Van Ness and the Dutch time to move to the south, following the White Squadron, who were heading north, and the English, not daring to assault the Dutch, slowly recovered from the crisis, and the Dutch not being attacked by the English because they were too afraid, to be clear, were able to recover from the crisis which could have brought the Dutch to defeat, and they recovered. But they paid a heavy price, of course, since a whole convoy of ships had to depart the battle, the heavier of the Dutch ships. And when they were sent to port, of course, this marked an interlude in the fighting, so a nice little break. However, soon after the ships had departed, the Dutch ships had departed, the fleets re-engaged, and during this brawl, however, no major events happened. Except for the 7 provinces, the Reuter's flagship was lost her mainmast, and Van Ness, the second in command, took over command while the Reuter and his flagship was absent to repair. Or was absent due to losing his mainmast. And the fighting continued west, causing the Reuter to drift off to the east, so he wasn't present. And Van Ness led the fleet for another 3 passes, giving the English a lot of grief, and the 56-gun loyal subject sailed back to port. Nearing the end of the third pass at roughly 6 o'clock, the 48-gun Black Eagle sank, so the first ship to sink due to leaks. And Dutch account reports that she took heavy shots to her windward side, and when she went for the tack, those holes, those holes, ended up on her leeward side under the waterline. And she sank. That simple, really. So, at the end of the third pass, Van Ness spotted some sails on the horizon. And good news for the Dutch. Those turned out to be the 12 ships of Tromp. So that's, of course, good news for the Dutch. And they had, of course, previously chased the rainbow of the fleet, but they were reunited, and of course, seeing Dutch reinforcements, not good for the British, and the British morale was crushed. And they were exhausted and unhappy due to Rupert not having returned yet, which had left with an entire squadron. And Albemarle ordered a course westbound, deploying the most damaged ships in the front and the ships in the better condition in the rear. And during this tactical retreat, the 40-gun St. Paul signaled the fleet that he took on water. He was taking water, and he could not stop the water, so the water kept on gaining. And unfortunately, she sank. However, her crew was able to escape via boat. Whilst the English made their withdrawal to the west, the Dutch needed to tack to be able to pursue the enemy. And the wind, however, died during this process. And this marks the end of the second day of battle. And the result was very costly for the Dutch, since they had to have a lot of ships disengage. 6 heavy ships and 2 lighter ships, which outweighed the loss of the English losses, which was 2 lighter ships and 8 ships disengaging of lighter nature, I believe. And like I mentioned earlier, the Dutch would definitely notice the loss of those ships. So, what were the British losses during day 1? They lost Spread Eagle and Young Prince, however those were fire ships, so as intended. And Black Eagle and St. Paul, they sank, so those were 48 and 40 guns. The British had the Anna of 58, Baltimore of 48, Bristol of 52, Loyal Subject of 56, and 4 unknown ships disengage. Which they were all 58 guns or lower. The Dutch, however, they lost the 60-gun Vrijheid, 64-gun Provincie van Utrecht, 70-gun Kaltenzoog, 73-gun Pacificatie, odd number, the Spiegel of 68-gun, the Vrede of 46-gun, and Macht van Enkhuizen 72, and an unknown. Also, they lost the Lifte due to a fire ship of 68 guns. So the Dutch lost a good part of their heavy ships. Without knocking out any of the British heavy ships. Only the lighter ones. So, that was day 1 and 2. Stay tuned for day 3 and 4 tomorrow and the conclusion. And so far, it looks not too pretty for either. It's hard, at this stage of the battle, it's hard to say. Both, right now the British are in a retreat essentially. However, the Dutch took some significant loss to the fleet, and that would be noticed. And when Rupert returns, the battle could go the other side. If you read Steel posts, I recommend it. It's in the link description below. It's a great post. I recommend you read it. That's my source, basically. But yeah, stay tuned if you want to see or listen to me babble on what's going to happen next, or just go to that post if you want to read, if you're impatient or whatever. But the next episode or part will come tomorrow at the same time as this did. I hope you enjoyed listening and watching, although there wasn't too much to watch really. And I'll see you next time. Bye!